My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Jordan Michelman. It's April 5th, 2024. We're at the Nicholson Library, Linfield University in McMinnville. Jordan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
The first question, and you can take this any way you want it, is why wine?
Well, wine wasn't the first thing I was really excited about, and it wasn't even necessarily the first drinks thing I was really excited about. I don't think, for me, I didn't really get turned on by wine until I was maybe in my late 20s and starting to get to travel and traveling for work as a journalist, especially spending time in places like Australia and United Kingdom and Europe, and that was the first place where I really met people my own age who were like, well, we don't go to the cocktail bar, we go to the wine bar. We drink wine, wine's what's cool. I'd never really thought about wine like that before. That was not really what the cool thing to do was when I was, going out in my 20s. I went to the University of Washington in Seattle and lived in Seattle for many years, and it was way more, cocktails, craft beer, coffee shops, that kind of stuff. Wine wasn't really, I didn't really think about it as being something for me, but traveling in other parts of the world, I met other people who were like, oh, well, wine's what's cool, we think wine's cool. Especially somewhere like, Melbourne, Australia, where it can be quite expensive to consume export liquors and cocktails and things, but wine, because there's this roaring domestic wine industry there, was a lot more sort of affordable, but also starting to creep in some of that cultural stuff of young people being really excited about wine, and I suppose really excited about wine through the context of whatever natural wine means, minimal intervention, yada yada, those kinds of stories, and that was sort of how I got turned on to it, was being in other parts of the world. But I live here in the Pacific Northwest, and by that point I was living in Portland, and so coming back home from that travel and being like, oh, maybe wine is for me, maybe wine is industry. Well, there was this whole incredible world of it in my backyard to sort of go and figure out and learn about and drink and try to figure out what I liked. And especially a huge culture in the city in Portland of bottle shops and places to go and learn and poke around and sort of absorb it all, and that's kind of what turned me on to it.
So let's talk a little bit about life before that. You mentioned University of Washington,
yeah.
Seattle. Tell me a little bit about sort of early life, upbringing, life before heading to college, and what drove you to the University of Washington?
I'm from Tacoma, Washington originally. My mom and dad are both New Yorkers, and they moved out to the Pacific Northwest from New York in the 70s, because my dad went to law school. He got into a law school in the Pacific Northwest, and they made the big move across the country and set up. So we had a very sort of funny... there was not a lot of other New York families in Tacoma, Washington in the 80s and 90s. And the joke was, that our house was the last stop on the L train, that it went under for 3,000 miles and came back out. Because of the kind of stuff that we would do at home and how my parents kind of talked and thought about the world and dressed and acted and all the rest of it and stuff. And so there's a little bit of kind of a third culture thing that my brothers and I have of growing up in this very New York kind of family, but in a not a very New York kind of place. I grew up in Tacoma, went to high school there and stuff, and when I was 15 or 16, I met another guy who became really good friends with. His name is Zachary Carlson, and he and I played music together, and we were in high school plays together. I was a drama geek in high school and thought all that stuff was really fun. And when I went away to college, he did a little bit of college stuff too, but he sort of fell into this world of specialty coffee, high-end coffee, which then at that time, and this is 2005, 2006, was pretty early for that culture. There was good coffee, of course, in the Pacific Northwest, and especially in places like Portland and Seattle, but not like there is now, where there's a cool coffee bar, sort of contemporary coffee bar, there's several in McMinnville you can go to, there's it's become this thing, and every town with 30,000 people around America has sort of a contemporary cool coffee bar in it these days. It wasn't like that then. But he got into it really early, and I went to college, but I played a lot of music, and I think music was the thing I cared about a lot more than the college stuff. I have a history degree, and I liked all that, but I was sitting in the back of class and writing songs, and kind of that was sort of where my head was at. And I played in some bands and got to do some touring and traveling and make some records, and I really cared about, took that stuff really, really seriously. When I was out traveling around, Zachary and I were still in touch, and we'd hang out all the time, and he'd even come out with my band sometimes and sort of roadie for us. He was living in Washington, D.C., but we'd meet up on the East Coast, and he'd come hang out with us for a couple of days. And he'd be like, oh, well, when you're in Chicago, you got to go to this coffee bar, or when you're in New York, you got to go to this coffee bar. And that really turned me on. I'd never really thought about coffee, but really any kind of drinks in a way that was really special. I'd worked as a bartender, catering bartender and stuff in college, but it wasn't really something that I just didn't really have any other space in my head for anything but music stuff. Even working as a bartender or things, I didn't care. It was just a job. But I got really turned on by coffee stuff, and he was working in all these great cafes, and we'd always kind of done art projects together, and even some kind of early website stuff or some early kind of comedy stuff. And yeah, one day he was all excited. He was like, I have this idea for a website, do you want to help me write headlines for it, help me write jokes for it, And I was kind of very 25 and was maybe going to go to law school, but I don't know, very privileged to be able to have moments like that in your life when you're 25. And I look back on that as being the ability to drift a little bit and just wait tables and just play in bands is made it so I was available to do this other thing that ended up being what I was supposed to do. Mm-hmm. So I said sure, and we started making this website, and he knew enough people in the coffee industry that he sort of knew who to make fun of and who to compliment and who to where the stories were and kind of stuff, and I was a quick learner, and we were able to start doing it and get some nice press about it and have people read it, and a guy who was writing about coffee for the New York Times wrote something very complimentary about us about 6 months in. That was really helpful, and it made it possible for us to start selling advertising and making money from it. And then that was really exciting because maybe we could write a website. Maybe we could just do this kind of stuff. But we had to know how to sell it too, and do sales and ads and all the rest of it. And we didn't know anything about how any of that worked, and didn't know what venture capital was or how money worked or any of it. Our dream was maybe someday we could do this and not have to wait tables or open up cafes. And for the first couple of years of it, my buddy would open a coffee bar at 6 a.m. and he'd work till noon, and he'd come home, take a shower, and work on the website till he fell asleep. Mm-hmm. And I had jobs where I was a delivery driver for a good chunk of that time, and so I could take something up to the office tower and come back down and sit in my car and write the website until another order came in, and then go around the order somewhere else, and then sit in the car in the parking lot of the Microsoft and write the website and kind of do that thing. So that's the website Sprudge. It is today the most popular coffee publication by readership in the world, and it's been my full-time job now since 2012 when I moved to Portland. And along the way from doing that, I think after a couple of years in, I started to think, okay, well, I really love coffee, and I still really love coffee, but it might be cool to write about other stuff. Actually, coffee is a pretty subtle thing to write about. Coffee's hard to write about. The most expensive, exquisite, perfectly sourced, perfectly roasted, perfectly prepared cup of coffee that maybe costs $50 is a black cup of liquid. And the thing that you get at the truck stop is a black cup of liquid. There's a lot of storytelling and history and culture and explanation and breaking old stigmas and stereotypes and stuff that are involved in writing about coffee. It's really hard. And still not something that very many people do. There's not a lot of coffee writers. There's not a lot of coffee media comparatively, especially to something like wine. But it's a good thing to do first, because if you're starting with the hardest thing, it makes describing the difference between a red wine and a white wine feel really easy comparatively. We're talking about one restaurant or another restaurant. If you've done nothing but write about coffee for a lot of years, that feels like it's like on an easier mode in the video game in a lot of ways. I still sort of feel like that comparatively. Coffee's the hardest thing. So we were able to meet people and kind of get to know people through the years. And I started especially doing stuff locally, writing about wine first and foremost locally. In Oregon, that was the first stuff that I ever really did outside of coffee was writing about wine.
Well, before we catch up on wine, I'm curious about a couple of things. Let's back up to music for a second. Your first passion.
Yeah.
Tell me about life in the music scene in your early 20s. What were some of the highlights for you? What were some of the kind of memorable moments?
Well, I love doing it. I mean, I always wanted to I wanted to pretend to be a musician. I used to pretend other people's songs were mine, and I played in every kind of little garage band. And, I was a bass player first. That was the thing that I got turned on. And there's some guy in my neighborhood that was a bass player, and I think my parents gave him $20 to give me lessons, kind of a thing. You know what I mean? Like but bass player is a great thing to do because it's very utility. Nobody really wants to be the bass player typically. So if you are one, you have a bass, you can play. There's always room. You can play, which is great, and I love doing that. So I just was always in bands, but I played saxophones and horns and stuff too, and wrote a lot of music, and that was mostly on guitar, and was able to kind of pick up and do, I had bands where I played keyboards in it and stuff too, so it was my whole world. Lived in houses with musicians where everybody was in each other's bands, and so I had years where I played probably 150 shows in a year, in between 3 or 4 different bands, and that was just really my whole world. I think that the thing for me with that was I was really bad at being chill about it. I was really bad. I wanted to make it. I wanted to make money from it, and I wanted to have it be a job, a career, and get to make records, which is cool, but also make money from it and stuff. And I got far enough to get to make records, which I loved doing, but we never made any money. And this was in that aughts era of, the record industry collapsing and Napster and all the rest of it and stuff. And everything I was doing was so kind of indie and small. I don't really think it was affected that much by all of that, but it was kind of a weird time to try to get going, playing music, making music and stuff. And I got to do some really fun touring for it, which I love doing. I always love playing shows and playing in lots of different kinds of bands that sounded like lots of different kinds of ways. And for me, I feel a little bit now with journalism, I get to do lots of different kinds of journalism that uses lots of different kinds of things that I'm excited about. And in a weird way, I think I was sort of doing the same thing with playing in bands where you could play in 4 or 5 different things and they all sounded really different. I was playing a different instrument in them and kind of always doing a little bit of everything, getting to be a generalist as a musician. And I think about what I do now as a journalist as being a generalist very much.
So obviously the idea for Sprudge was kind of fairly organic and fairly kind of at the beginning kind of low stakes.
Yeah.
I'm curious about learning to write that way, learning to write about coffee or about anything, coming from a non-journalistic background. Tell me about starting to write and starting to get into that world.
Yeah, in the very beginning of it, it was just headlines, and so we were writing joke headlines, trying to kind of make people laugh or be funny or be kind of tabloid. It was just about headlines, and eventually we stopped wanting to only share other people's stories and write our own stories. Well, that meant we had to write them. And I remember there was an opening in Seattle of Starbucks was doing these stealth Starbucks in that era, 2009, 2010, opening these cafes that kind of looked like independent cafes, but were actually Starbucks cafes. And they're all gone now, but this was a thing that company tried. And there was one that was opening right down the street from my business partner's apartment. And so we went on opening day, the morning of opening day, and we were we're going to report on this. We're going to play a journal, pretend to be journalists and report on this. And Howard Schultz was there, and I got to meet him. And I remember meeting him and just saying hi, I'm Jordan. I didn't even know to actually introduce us. But then we wrote about it. But it was a funny time for web journalism because it's kind of pre-social media, like there was social media and Facebook and MySpace were big things, you know. Then MySpace especially was a really huge thing in the music world, and like we were booking tours on MySpace and stuff. That was kind of that era. Networking with other bands that we were playing shows with on MySpace, that was the big thing, which just sounds like a billion years ago. It really, really does. But that was what was cool, I assure you. But so, you know, writing the first thing about that place, you know, we had our story out before the Seattle Times did. We were the first place that would beat the Stranger, would beat the Times. You know, we were the little scrappy indie. But it meant we got all the clicks. And it meant actually, this was back, there was still sort of honor within that wider world that, you know, when a couple of days later the Times thing emerged, they linked to us. They were like, well, these was first reported by Sprudge. And that was huge for us, you know, huge. Big thing to be able to show your parents when your parents are like, are you, you know, what are you going to do with yourself? Well, my blog got in the Seattle Times, Dad. What do you think about that? You know, that was like really big. From the beginning with that, you know, the idea for us was that our concept only worked if we did it every day. You couldn't do it once a week, couldn't be once a month. It wasn't a personal blog, it was a news blog, it was a news site, website. We broke stories, we write about stories, news, criticism, analysis, culture. So for that to work, you gotta do it every day. You gotta pretend like you're one of the big websites that you're imitating, and you gotta wake up and do it every single day and fill the page every single day. And we had no idea how to do it other than we were sure that you had to do it every day for it to work, and for it to be funny, for like the joke or the parody or whatever we were trying to do to work. We had to do it every day. And so we did. And we were very 25, and neither of us really valued our time or dignity or knew how to, you know what I mean? You just sort of did it. It was that, or I was gonna take a $200,000 loan and go to fucking law school like my dad, and I didn't really, and my brothers who were lawyers, and you know, and I didn't think that was, I wasn't sure that I thought that was exactly what I wanted to do, and I was gonna try to see if I could do this other thing first.
So, tell me about the name Sprudge.
Yeah, so in the very, very beginning, when it was just the headlines, it was a visual parody of the Drudge Report. So it looked like that headline, not in political ideology or whatever, but like in a visual style of that broadsheet of little black headlines that roll down the page with occasional images and stuff. And so we did like a coffee Drudge Report for like the first 6 months, which is exactly as weird and left field as it sounds. And it was when we started writing our own stories that we were like, okay, we're just gonna have it look like a news website and not have it look like the Drudge Report. But that's what it looked like for the first like 6 or 7 months. But the headline thing still continues to be really, really important. And like the headlineology that we learned in those early days continues to be often the most important thing, especially, you know, for what journalism reads like now, where so much of it is condensed down into social media and all the rest of it. What your headline is still that makes or breaks the story. It's still just as important as it ever was. And we really, I mean, we would fight, we'd lose whole days, just knockout, drag out fights over headlines, over what it was gonna be, and having to get it perfect. We're better at it now, we're a lot more efficient at it now, which is good.
Between MySpace and the Drudge Report, I'm having some major flashbacks.
That was sort of what the era was, you know, but like, we loved all these kind of websites back then, like, you know, Gawker and Wonkat, you know, political websites. That was also the era of like, you know, stuff like Pitchfork being the hugest deal, Vice being the hugest deal, you know, and I mentioned those websites because none of them exist anymore. And if you had told me in 2009 that Sprudge was going to be around longer than fucking Vice, apologize for swearing on the archive.
Swear all you want.
If you had told me that Sprudge was going to be around longer than Pitchfork, I would have, I don't even know what, you know what I mean? I would have been like, wow, when did the nuclear bomb drop? How did we survive the fallout?
How is coffee the last thing in the world?
Why am I still writing a coffee website in the nuclear holocaust? Like what, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, but that's verily what has happened.
So tell me, you mentioned obviously not having any idea about profiting from your work at the start. So tell me about entering into a place where it became a job and it became something that you could actually make a living from.
Yeah, we had people in, coffee culture has a very, and wine is like this in a lot of ways too, it attracts intellectuals. I think sometimes kind of frustrated intellectuals. People who want journalism and writing around what they do, and who appreciate people that are able to kind of have a POV, and our website very, very much did. And there were a couple of local companies that pretty early on were like, oh, this is great. There was a little bit of trade media that was around, some glossy magazines and stuff. There wasn't really a website like what we were doing. And that is another thing that is incredibly dated. Like, I'll occasionally talk to younger journalists or people that I meet through through freelance stuff, and they'll be like, oh, how did you be able to make this thing? I was like, well, there just wasn't a website for what we were doing, so we decided to do it, which is essentially the journalistic equivalent of saying, well, I bought my house in 1980 for $20,000, and I simply waited until it was worth $2 million. No big deal. Easy, anybody can do it. It's the exact same thing. We just were really lucky. We were really, really lucky and kind of in the right place at the right time. And coffee's grown so incredibly much since we started, and we were able to sort of have a front row seat to it. I think we were able also, in some ways, to maybe kind of help juice it. Having there be a daily broadsheet for it that really covered it in depth and treated it as being worthy of journalism the same way food is, the same way chefs are, the same way wine is, the same way all these other kinds of things. There's a lot of industries that take it as a matter of course that what they do would be written about by journalists. If you work in the movies, everything you do gets written about, And there's been these things like The Hollywood Reporter and Variety that have been writing about the minutiae of the Hollywood industries for 100 years. There was nothing like that for coffee really when we started, and all we really did was say, well, this deserves it too. Becoming a job. Yeah, we worked other jobs, and this was one of the things with the music stuff. My parents, in their infinite wisdom, made a really big point of saying, well, we're going to help you with college, but when you're done with college, we're not going to help you anymore. You got to figure out what you're going to do. And if you need to come back and stay at the house for a month and figure it out or whatever, you can. But, we'll be disappointed if that's what you do. And that's not what your brothers did. You need to figure out what you're supposed to do. And so it meant, I worked every other kind of job that I possibly could, and was thinking about maybe doing more school. And some of that was to kick the can on figuring out what I actually wanted to do, which I think is a lot of times what people do. But this website, we started to kind of be like, oh, well, maybe there's some gold in them, our hills. Like, maybe we'll make some money from it, and we can, make some money from it. And that turned into saying, well, maybe we could just do this as our jobs. How cool would that be? And then that turned into saying, well, maybe it wouldn't have to be just the two of us filling up the fucking page every day. Maybe we could have some help, Maybe we wouldn't have to be both the editors and the marketing directors. Maybe we could hire somebody to help us with marketing, And that's kind of snowballed its way along for 15 years. But it's really cool. There's stuff about it that feels like a job, but I think there's stuff about it that still feels really cool and loose, and I'm so grateful for that. I don't even realize how good I have it, I'm so grateful for it, but I'm also so spoiled. I'm so lucky, and I just try to be really real about that with people. It's very fortunate, because there's lots of kinds of jobs. If you want some good perspective on this, my business partner, his fiance, they just got engaged, but they've been together for 10 years, is an anesthesiologist at Sirius in the hospitals, mostly at OHSU. And so for us, when we have a bad day, we're like, oh, our headline could have been better, or these marketing people, they think they're gonna take a month off, That's a bad day for us. But for him, a bad day, it's like somebody fucking died, And there's a lot of jobs like that where your bad day is truly a bad day. And I have a job where when I have a bad day, it's not that bad.
It's a nice place to be. Tell me about, you mentioned wine being kind of coinciding with your move to Portland 2012.
Yeah.
Tell me about starting to think about things other than coffee and starting to think about wine in that way.
Yeah, I just, had some fun nights with it, out traveling around. And I mentioned running around in Melbourne and that being really cool. I think there was another really influential set of time that I had the first time that I went to London, being in London in like 2013, and having some of these same experiences at these, comparatively pretty early kind of proto-cool wine bar, natural wine bar sort of places, and just being really turned on by it and being like, wow, this is, this feels like it's kind of for me. And it's interesting because that natural wine thing, in some ways, it was held up as like disruptive or a break from the orthodoxy. But I'm from a generation of wine drinkers where it was the orthodoxy. It's what we all started drinking first. It wasn't about unlearning fine wine and taking, natural wine as the new revolutionary force. It was already in place. It was the cool thing, coming back to Portland, the thing for me is that it felt like I kind of wanted to write about it, and I started reading more about it, like to learn, reading all the Jay McInerney books, where there was a very sort of literary, cultural approach to writing about wine, but then also, reading like the Kevin Israeli Windows on the World wine book, just to like kind of know what I didn't know, reading some of the Alice Firing stuff, where it's very very culture, wine as a cultural war sort of kind of a thing, but done in a style where the writing's very interesting and spiky and fun. I was like, oh, well, maybe someday I could do that too, right? Like I write, I'm a writer, so maybe I could do this kind of stuff too. And I had this funny set of, I don't know, there was a day where I was like, well, I'm going to email the alt weeklies. Nobody writes about wine for the Willamette League, and nobody writes about wine for the Mercury, so I'll cold call them. People will cold call us sometimes at Sprudge and say they want to write about coffee, and every once in a while their ideas are good and we'll buy stuff from them, so maybe I could do that there. And a couple of weeks later, a guy named Matthew Corfidge, who was then one of the editors at the Willamette Week, he's now with USA Today and Gannett newspapers, wrote me back and was like, hey, sure, let's talk. And I went in and met with him and another guy named Martin Sismar, who's now with Condé Nast and does a lot of work at Wired. And they were like, okay, come meet us at the office, and I went and met them it's the first time I'd ever been in a real journalism office, a real newspaper office or whatever, and they had the bullpens, and it kind of looked like you imagine it would look. It was really cool. And I brought along like 4 bottles of wine, and I got them drunk, and by the end of it they were like, sure, you can write about wine for us. And I was like, okay, sounds great. So they started letting me write about wine for them, and one of the first big things I did was write this package that was kind of, the new Oregon wine, and I remember Martin wrote the headline wrote the cover headline for it that said like, not your papa's Pinot, like it's like, this is like the new wine, it's like cool wine or whatever, which in retrospect is pretty cringy, but like I think at the time they wanted to sort of yell at the mountain and kind of make a splash and do something kind of buzzy, and I think they got some angry emails from people, but I also know all the young, scrappy, negotiable, garage-y winemakers that were featured in it fucking loved it, and I still drink some of those wines that I wrote about in that story. This was probably early 2015 by now. I'm still in touch with some of those winemakers and have followed their work and their wines and stuff over the last decade, and they're all, almost all of them are still making wine. Wines have gotten better, a lot of them, and but it was just, I cold called. I sent an email and was like, hey, I do this stuff, but I'd really love to do this stuff, so, and I think I kind of talked a little bit of shit too. I was like, well, here's your, you have the best food section in town. I told them both. You've got the best food section in town, but nobody writes about wine. Here's your newspapers, and your city is literally, and you can grow grapes in the city if you choose. You're in the middle of wine country, and nobody writes about wine. What's the deal? Let me do it. And I think some of that is a little like bluff or like fake it till you make it. We did that. I mean, we did that for a long time at Sprudge too.
As you were learning about wine in general and the Oregon wine scene specifically at that point, tell me what your impressions were of the world of wine kind of in general, but specifically of what you were seeing in Oregon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I, at that time, saw it in a very binary kind of A-B way. Like, there was the, quote, natural wine, and there was the, quote, traditional wine, which is very binary black and white way of seeing the world. I do not think about wine the same way now. But it made sense to me then as a way in, because it had heretofore felt to me like wine was wrapped up in a lot of kind of age and class and status and stuff that I didn't really relate to, that didn't feel like it was for me. And so I needed there to be this wedge of like, not your Papa's Pinot, of like a new thing that could be for me. And then I was able to grab onto that and say, okay, well, that's the way in, you know? And so drinking all this kind of young, punky wine, that's all I wanted to do. And it was the only kind of stuff that I wanted to do. And I remember going with my parents to a winery. They had come down to come hang out, and they were like, well, we want to go to a winery. And choosing one that felt a little bit more parentally appropriate, you know, because the winemakers that I was writing about don't have wine tasting rooms, you know, they don't have vineyards. They don't have, you know, it's this punky, they share a space, or they're making it in a basement off the side of the road or whatever, you know. Going to one of these kinds of places and being like, oh, I don't like any of this wine very much, but, you know, buying a bottle and having the bottle cost like $70, which I think was by far the most I'd ever spent on a bottle of wine, and kind of being like, oh, well, it's not ready, it won't be ready, it's not ready to drink yet, you know. And I still have that bottle from that trip. And I bet you it tastes really good now. I bet you I'd like it a lot now. You just keep drinking and trying more stuff, and eventually somebody pours you a really good glass of Burgundy, and you're like, oh. I mean, that was my experience. I think that's a lot of people's experience. And if that happens, well, that's another thing that bounces right back to Portland bounces right back to the Pacific Northwest, because if you've gotten kind of turned on the power of how good more classically styled wines are, well, then all of a sudden you discover you live in this place where you can scratch that itch 30 miles from your house, and in ways that are different, but really compelling. And somewhere else then down the line, I, you know, had somebody pour me, you know, old wine, vintage wine that was really good. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. And well, and that's another thing that echoes right back to Oregon, because if you like vintage wine, you know, the way some of the Oregon wines age and the incredible comparative value that's available from going back through the decades and drinking older wines in Oregon. I feel like wherever I'm at with being interested in wine, it's never hard to find that echo back to stuff that's here. And that keeps happening in my life as a wine drinker and a wine writer.
You talked about the kind of the early people you were focusing on being kind of the punk, the garage, I guess the garage band, the garage yeast winemaker.
Yeah.
What was your impression of those wines and of the people drinking them? Did you foresee what's happened to Oregon wine over the last decade happening, and the kind of the more people making more varietals in more ways and more people being attracted to them? Or did it feel like a very underground kind of punk scene?
Something that I like to kind of talk about is like feeling like I don't have a special palate, or like there's not anything special about me for the stuff that I like. And if I really like something, actually it makes all the sense in the world that everybody else is going to get turned on by that in a couple years, or everybody else is on their way to figuring that out. And I feel like that's kind of what happened with natural wine. I feel like that's kind of what happened with specialty coffee, you know. And so it's cool. And you also get to nudge it along a little bit by writing about it and helping it. You get to put your thumb on the scale, and I like that. You know, natural wine and whatever you want to call it, the indie wine, garage yeast wine, millennial wine, you know, however you want to talk about it. It makes all the sense in the world that it would be ascendant now in retrospect, but it felt pretty out there and fringe, and I didn't get into it early. Me being into it 2014, 2015, there's people who are into it for 20 years at that point who are the real heads, you know, really know what's up. And same way with coffee. And we started a coffee website in 2009, but there have been people doing progressive specialty coffee for decades before that too, you know. So I'm late. it makes sense that it started to roll downhill and pick up steam and stuff. And something that happens is that there's these, within drinks, there's these sort of layers of trends, right? Like, and it all follows that Sartrean arc, right? You know, this idea of like something goes from being like incredibly fringe and out there to avant-garde, to ascendantly trendy, to excessively cool, and then the downslope towards like mundane mass acceptance. Like this is this thing that happens, and you can follow it in all kinds of trends in human life, but I think especially in drinks trends. And it's been really interesting to get to watch that happen with natural wine. I had this long conversation about this with Martin Sismar, who I worked with at the Willamette Week, where he said, you don't even realize you're doing it, but you have this, you love to write about something and call it the new cool thing, and then 5 years later write about it and say it's over. You love doing that. And I kind of did, you know. I was doing a lot of this natural wine writing here and then increasingly nationally. And then I wrote a story in 2022 for Bon Appetit that was like, is natural wine losing its cool factor? Is natural wine not cool anymore? Which infuriated people, you know. And so now I've infuriated people on both sides. You know, I've infuriated both traditional and the sort of avant wine people, but that's the right thing, right? I mean, probably. It's interesting.
It's engaging.
Yeah. Well, you shouldn't be into the same stuff your whole life. You know, like you shouldn't like the same thing 5 years later, or listen to the same music 10 years later, or, you know. I mean, there's some stuff in life, like, I think it's okay to have a relationship that lasts your whole life, friendships that last your whole life, but the food you drink, the music you listen to, all that other kind of stuff, you should always be changing how you think about it and getting turned on to different things. That's what keeps life interesting.
So you mentioned that by 2022 you were writing for Bon Appetit. Give me some of the kind of the ascendant milestones of your writing, from sort of starting with Sprudge, getting into Willamette Week Wine. What were some of the other places you worked for and things you wrote about in the time in between? Yeah,
in 2018, Sprudge did our first book. And that was a really lucky, cool thing that happened where we were actually at a natural wine festival, 2018 Natural Wine Festival in Oakland. And we were hanging around, you know, around at the after party, and had somebody we knew say, oh, well, wouldn't you like to meet our friend? Would you like to meet my friend? She's an acquisitions editor for Penguin Random House. And it's like, yes, I'd like to meet your friend who's the acquisitions, yes, sure. But then their friend turned out to be a very lovely person who, her name is Emily Timberlake, and she is somebody that I've stayed in touch with for lots of years, and she's doing a ton of cool writing now too, but she was working on the publishing side of it then. And they said, oh, well, we don't have a coffee book, you know, we've got a hole in our schedule, can you have you know, we can sign you to do this thing, but we need a manuscript in like 4 months. And we're like, sure, well, we're blog guys, so we fill up the page, that's fine, no big deal. It's 100 pages in 4 months with some illustrations, it's cool. Sounds good. So we did it, and getting to do that book with Penguin Random House and their imprint 10-speed press gave us some good cred, and meant we got to meet lots of people in food and beverage publishing writing world. And you know, we were going out and we did a book tour for the book and spent a lot of time, you know, in New York and LA and all the rest of it and stuff, and got to meet lots of people. And you know, I was always kind of trying to squeak the wheel a little bit and say, hey, so nice to meet you, you know, I'd love to pitch you, you know, for other kind of stuff. And you know, and then you gotta have your pitches be good and read everything they published for the last 3 months and understand where you can fit in and help as a freelancer and all the rest of it. But and that's something that I think has been really helpful for me, is that I work as an editor. You know, I buy pitches freelance, you know, and work as an editor and work with writers. So the best thing you can ever do if you want to be a freelancer is work as an editor, and the best thing I think you can ever do if you want to work as an editor is be a freelancer, because it teaches you empathy, and you know how to wear both hats, and how to mess up and not mess up, and how to chill out and understand how unimportant you are or how timely you need to be, and all the rest of it. You know, it helps you build the callus on both thumbs. It's good. So doing that book was really big, though, in retrospect, because I got to meet lots of people, and it kind of legitimized. We were still kind of blog guys, coffee blog guys, which is really, out there. But it legitimized us a little bit, and it was nice too, because we'd meet media people, and they'd say, "Oh, love your website. I was in Tokyo and I used it to find a cafe," or "Love your website. You beat us to this story," And that was nice, That was kind of a cool thing to do. In retrospect, a really big thing. And it's meant that I got to meet lots of people and start to do more of that kind of more freelance, national freelance. And doing the stuff for the people out in New York was cool. New York is its whole own world and very within its own orbit of itself, And Los Angeles is the same way, London's the same way. There's a poster that's like an old New Yorker cover that hung in my dad's office his whole life. So I grew up looking at it, and now it hangs in where I work in my home. That's it's called The View from 9th Avenue. It's a famous New Yorker cover where it goes, The View from 9th Avenue. It's 9th Avenue in detail, 8th Avenue in detail, 7th Avenue, down to the Hudson River. And then a simple matte cartoon for the Great Plains, and like one building for Los Angeles, and then the ocean and some birds. And it's this idea of like the all-encompassing myopia of living in a place like that. And you can do the same cartoon for Los Angeles, do the same cartoon for London, there's lots of places like that. But sometimes you can come in from the outside and solve a problem or have a different perspective, or and hopefully be easy to work with and all that stuff. I started to get to do more of that for the people in New York, and I think that it probably helps a little bit that I grew up speaking New York. It's kind of helpful. And when I go back and spend time there, I'm going to be back there at the end of the week next week. I get a little bit of that like salmon return to spawn thing, like I know I have been here, but there's something about this stream to me feels right. There's a thing about it when I go. So that's been helpful to get to do that kind of stuff with those folks. And, doing a lot of work like for Punch, the drinks publication Punch, which does do some smart wine writing and is a good wine publication, but they're generalists. They do a lot of cocktail writing and do a lot of other kinds of beer writing and stuff. And they were owned by Penguin Random House when I started working with them. It's now part of Vox, so it sort of co-publishes with Eater. But I'm still doing some fun stuff with them, and I got to do a story with them in 2019 that was, I wanted to write something about mineral water. I really like mineral water a lot. I think water in general is just like delicious and a culinary thing that we overlook a little bit in America for complicated reasons. But then you go to other parts of the world and it's baked into the cake. I mean, every cool restaurant in Florence has their selection of the incredible mineral water, still or sparkling, and people are trying to outdo each other for the most interesting, delicious one they can serve, and it's like this important cultural thing. You find it like that all over London too, different parts of the world, all over Spain, but it's not really like that here. And so I got to work on a story for them to talk about that a little bit, and that was a really successful story for me in 2020, as the world shit itself, right as all of that was happening, it won a James Beard Award. And I didn't get to go, there wasn't an event that year. It's the only time they've ever hosted it where it was just online. So I didn't get to like go and meet people, but it was like a Zoom or whatever, but it doesn't matter. It's like, if you had a story in the New York Times once, you can say you had a story in the New Yorker once, you can say you're a New Yorker writer. It doesn't matter if it was the half of a paragraph on the bottom of the last page. Like, nobody cares. Like, And I did a weird like plague. I won a plague beard, but it's fine. And like once that happens, that helps a lot. To have people, even if they're politely declining you, it makes people will politely decline you. Mm-hmm. People look at your stuff.
So with that award, I remember reading that you had some interesting, the finalists for that award were interesting companies.
Yeah.
So tell me about the feeling of being in that company and of winning.
Yeah, well, it was Ray Isle and Eric Asimov, right? There's a funny thing with Eric Asimov. My grandfather's older brother, so my great uncle Herbert Michelman, was an editor for Crown Publishing in New York City. And one of the things he did as an editor for Crown Publishing in New York City was edit a few of Isaac Asimov's books. And he's mentioned in the I. Asimov autobiography, and they were like contemporaries, Herb Michelman. And so when we both got nominated, I sent Eric an email and was like, hey, love your stuff, just wanted to, this is kind of a funny random thing, you probably hear about this all the time about your uncle or whatever, but like, my great uncle knew your uncle, and it's just kind of small world or whatever, and I think he was like, haha, great. But yeah, I don't know, what am I supposed to say? It was cool, it was cool, man, it was great. I think, people probably put too much emphasis on all of it, but I will say, I think maybe particularly not coming from a pro journalism background, not coming from J school, not coming from working at big newspapers, big publishing companies, coming out of blog world, and then winning one of those things was really cool. I think people talk about this the same sometimes about like, it's one thing to win an Oscar and you were in the biggest movie of the year, but it's another thing if it happens like a little tiny movie that thing happens to, and then it's like, oh shit, you should maybe pay attention to this. And it felt like that a little bit, which was great. And, it changed my life. It's been really good.
So as you've written more, as you've pitched more, obviously the topics have varied. You already mentioned mineral water, obviously. Tell me about some of the other things that have caught your interest as you sort of expand your portfolio. What are some things that you have been excited to learn about, and what are some things you've written that are particularly meaningful to you?
I've been doing a lot more restaurant writing, and I like restaurant writing. It's in some ways the hardest one because everybody's got an opinion on restaurants, and there's the most restaurant writing. So, but wine feels like that a little bit too. And wine's got the oldest, there's wine writing in the Bible, there's wine writing is really old. So there's lots of layers of difficulty with that kind of stuff too. There's part of me sometimes where I'm like, oh, well, I wish I was a restaurant critic, or I wish I was just writing about restaurants, but I don't know if I actually do. It's something that I've gotten to do a little bit more of, and I want to do a lot more of, and have been working on something now that the last couple of weeks, I did a big round of it this week, and I'm getting ready to file it in the next day or two, that's a little bit more kind of like true crime, or like writing about like, this thing I've been working on is like a ghost story. It's like a haunted hotel in London, but that happens to be haunted in like a very modern way. It's like a 21st century haunted hotel, and that kind of stuff's really interesting. I think the thing for me has been to say like, okay, well, the first thing I learned how to write about was coffee, and it was kind of, because we were trying to make a company out of it, right? But then I was like, oh, I want to write about, all this other kind of beverage stuff, because that sounds like fun and seems interesting. And then it was like, well, I should write about food too. I should write about restaurants too. And the Willamette Week guys had me doing that pretty early. They would send me out maybe 2015, 2016. They'd get into some roaring argument about trying to decide what should be the number 6th and the number 8 restaurant in the 20 best, and they would send me to solve the argument because they couldn't agree. They let me do some stuff like that early on that was really impactful, and I'll always be grateful to those guys for letting me do that kind of work for them. Doing the restaurant stuff now, it's kind of making me say, oh, well, like maybe I can just write. Like maybe I can write about whatever. So I did a piece for Portland Monthly Magazine in 2021 that was this big weird like Zodiac killer story, but it's really like a blog story. So this guy, there's a guy in Portland who for the last 20 years has run the most popular website in the world about Zodiac killer stuff, like the official zodiackiller.com website. And I had a little sympathy for him because I also run the most popular website in the world for this like very niche thing. So like definitely, like, I was a little simpatico with that guy. I thought what he was doing was interesting. But I just think that, I don't know. I'm like a million people. It gives you a little scare at night before you fall asleep. I love stuff like that. I think it's really interesting. I grew up reading, my dad was an attorney, and he had all the Anne Rule books and true crime books and stuff, and I loved all that stuff. And I think it'd be fun to do more stuff. Like that. I think it's cool to do stuff that you're bad at. I think you should. For me, it's really fulfilling, and I feel oddly compelled, sort of compelled, masochistically compelled to try to do forms of writing that I'm bad at. I liked learning how to do drinks writing and being bad at it. I've really loved learning how to do food writing and getting to sort of go through, and I still am very much going through layers of learning how to like be bad at it and learn by doing it. But with stuff like true crime, stuff like fiction, you only get to do it by putting in the time. You only get to do it by being bad at it. And it's hard because I write for a living, so there's part of me that's like every minute I'm spending doing writing that I'm bad at, that I may never make money from, I'm picking my own pocket. But the flip side is, if I wanted to work jobs that were boring and safe, I would have gone to law school. So to me, it feels like it's cool to try to do other kind of stuff and let myself have that night a week or night a month, or take some time in the summer to work on this other kind of stuff. Yeah.
So with all of that, how do you balance the work? Obviously, you have to throw yourself into whatever it is you're working on. It's not, everything takes the research and the time. So how do you balance that, and how do you sort of keep your stories straight as you're working on them?
I think that, it's hard, but efficiency is the most important thing. I think that for journalism, you'll sometimes meet journalists, and there's some journalists whose work I really respect, and who I find personally, very inspiring and cool. But you talk to them and they're like, oh, I just labor over it. Oh, it just kills me. Every paragraph is death. I don't enjoy it. I hate it. And it's like, well, that sucks. That sounds like a hard life, your stuff's really good, but that sounds like a bummer. That's not me. That's not me. I want to get really hot and write 5,000 words. That's what I like. That's the feeling that feels good to me. That's what I'm into. And even if only half of them are good, that's what's fun. And when you get to tap into that, that's the most exciting stuff. I had a night like that a couple nights ago, and I'm still like, I'm still really like, kind of high from it. But being really efficient is this important thing too, and that's something that we've learned along the way as publishers. Publishing a website, can't recommend it enough. If you want to be a writer, be an editor, be a publisher, because learning that other side of it, it gets you into understanding like the speed chess element of it. I had somebody give me a piece of advice, a journalist, when I was very, 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 very early, before I would have even, I think, said I was a journalist to someone. And he had gone to Berkeley J School and was very high up in New York stuff or whatever. And he told me, in journalism, you have to learn, some stories are a marathon and other stories are a sprint. And it's your job to learn which is which. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really get it then, but now I talk about it all the time. We talk about it all the time. I share that all the time with writers, talk about that all the time with other people, because it's really true. And it sounds like you're just talking about time, but you're also talking about how emotionally invested you get in it and how much you care about, it's not that you want to care about everything, you want everything that goes out to be good, but there is an element of it where it's like you gotta go on to the next, you gotta move on to the next. I like bands where they have 30 albums. I like Prince. If you like Prince, you can listen to 30 albums. I like the Grateful Dead. If you like the Grateful Dead, you can listen to 3,000 live shows that are all different and all have different color to them, or all have a different approach to them. And it's that big volume of stuff. I like writers where I like Tom Wolfe. If you like Tom Wolfe, you can read 6 epic novels and all these collections of journalism and all the nonfiction, reporting, and it's this whole ecosystem you get to swim around in and live with. That's the stuff that's cool to me. And it's great if you can write one really great story a year, but I don't. I like the volume part. That's what's hard. Anybody can get up and hit a home run. Not anybody, but you can get up and have a good at bat, right? But people don't take you seriously in baseball, until you do it 140 of the 162 games a year. And if you can do it right 3 out of 10 times, you're in the Hall of Fame, I think about writing like that. It's volume business. That's what's fun to me. And so that thing of managing the other stuff is part of that game. That's what part of that is. And that's the stuff that's the part of it I like the most, weirdly. I like that. And it's got a utility to it also of writing for lots of different places and working with lots of different editors. Not every story, but sometimes you get to the end of it and you're a little sick of each other. Well, that's okay. I'm going to do something for somebody else and we'll talk in a month. That's great. It's really nice. I think the alternative would be really hard, and especially in the old days where everybody was in these bullpens together all day long and on top of each other and having to, do the interpersonal thing all day long on top of the work thing, But it's really nice what I get to do now because it is kind of, bifurcated off, sectioned off. I like it the same way I liked playing in 5 different bands that sounded completely different, where I played different instruments. That was what was fun to me.
So obviously you have an editing side, you have a writing side. Let's talk about the editing side first and developing that. Again, not coming from a formal background of that. Tell me about developing that skill and figuring out how to do it, figuring out how it worked for you. How have you developed in that over time?
Yeah, well, doing that specifically around coffee was really interesting because we kind of were getting to make it up as it went along. There wasn't this, again, I don't want to say there's no other coffee writing there was, but not like a lot of the other kind of industries. It felt really kind of young and open. And so for us, we wanted to be able to run stuff that was like the stuff that we wrote, but written by other people from other perspectives and all the rest of it. And in the early days of it, I was the one editing all of it. And sometimes those would be stories that would come in and they were perfect. You didn't have to change anything. And sometimes those were stories that would come in where you were going to go back and forth with the writer 5 times because they were just learning how to do it too, and there wasn't really a playbook to go by. And sometimes you wind up with stuff that almost feels more like a co-write. Sometimes you wind up with stuff where you didn't have to change a comma. Every one of them was a little different. And sometimes you get into a rhythm with writers too, where they know how you're going to edit and they're able to send you things and say, well, I wasn't sure about this, but I know you're going to do what you want to do with it anyways, so do your thing. And that's a cool way to kind of be. And learned on the job. We just sort of did it. I mean, we started to get this hunch that we wanted to buy writing from other people because we wanted to be able to write more about other places that we didn't know about, and the people reading our website increasingly started to be from other parts of the world. And so we wanted to buy writing from writers in Japan, and we wanted to buy writing from writers in India and from other parts of the world, and develop those relationships, and also like learn when to back off and learn when like actually you were wrong and you shouldn't be imposing your POV on somebody else's stuff, and like, all of it. And it kind of comes along the way, and sometimes there's people who are like, no, don't do that, and that's good too. And then you have to justify the decision or say, okay, you're right, I won't, and I think about that a lot too on the other side of saying like, I love being edited, I love having people change my stuff, I'm often telling editors, be more active. I don't want to play the game of telephone where I'm guessing at what you want me to do. Just do it. Change the move the paragraph up. You just do it. I'm not precious about it, But everybody's got a different approach, and I also think that there's like different ways that it's taught, in the J schools and what the approach is. And sometimes you're working with editors who are almost like, is it okay if we did this? Is it okay? And it's like, yes. Not only is it okay, you should just do it so we can be efficient and like, and we'll make it happen. It's like, it's good, it's fine. But everybody's got a different take on that stuff. I know really accomplished writers who will notice every comma that you move and kind of take offense to it. I'm not a writer like that. I've done too much editing. I've edited too many stories to care about someone editing mine. I love editing. The goal is that it's a better piece. And if editing makes it the better piece, then I appreciate the time that got put into it by the editor, and that's the best case scenario.
And on the writing side, a similar question. Tell me how you've improved as a writer. Tell me how, in addition to the volume, in addition to the kind of the efficiency, the actual writing, what about your writing now do you appreciate versus kind of when you were getting started?
Well, the efficiency is a really big part of that, because that's the thing that I want. I want professional at bats. I want to be able to get up and hit a single when it's time to get up and hit a single. It sounds like I'm diminishing it, but it's not. It's the most important stuff. And it's the stuff that other writers, other pro journalists see and respect, that kind of work. And I see it in other people's writing, and it's part of what I really respect about other writers that I respect. But I think that I think coming from blog world, and coming from my own blog, me and my business partner, part of that learning on the job thing was being able to learn to have some voice, or like put myself more into stuff, or have more of my point of view and stuff. And a lot of the writers who I really love very much have that. And I was able to develop that very organically through my own stuff, through having my own website. And when I started getting to do things for other people, there was part of me wondering, like, oh, am I going to have to take that all out? Are they going to want me to take that all out? But I've been doing it long enough for now that often the notes that I'll get from people is to say, put more in, do more of that, write for more of that. That appears to be like a gear that you're very comfortable in, so do more of that kind of stuff. And I had a conversation with a young writer who was like, hey, will you talk to me about writing stuff? And I always love to do that. And I had writers that talked to me about that when I was starting out, and I always want to make time to do that. It's an important thing. And he was like, oh, your stuff has so much voice. That's the kind of stuff I want to do. I want to do writing like that has voice. How do you do that? And I was like, well, I don't know, man. Do it for like 10 years, and then if you have editors that trust you, they'll let you do it. It seems like a hard thing to like kind of master plan, or like a hard thing to come in and say, I only want to do that kind of stuff, right? Or like that's my goal, is to do stuff like that. But maybe it is a thing that you can iteratively do and earn, right? Like, and maybe I've been able to do a little bit of that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's another one of the things that, like, when I say trying to do other kinds of journalism or trying to write fiction and things like that, where you get to really pull that out, because that's what it all is, right? I mean, you're really just writing from the hip there, and that stuff's hard, really hard, and I love spending time doing it, because then when I go back to the journalism stuff, I'm like, oh, this is like cool. I place a quote and,
rules.
Build it all out. Yeah, I know exactly how this is supposed to go, versus the other shit, which is so impossibly hard and challenging that, like, you come back to the thing and it's like, if you try to run, you run with one of those 50-pound vests on, and then the next day you run without it, you're like, oh.
You mentioned earlier the big lesson for you deciding if a story is a marathon or a sprint. You have a story that you've decided is a marathon, something you're going to sink your teeth into. What's the timeline and process like for you? How much are you willing to give to a project like that? Let's talk about the mineral water story, for example. How much did that take?
I don't recall that one being especially really, really time demanding. That was a story that had, I think, a pretty good amount of kind of a little personal stuff in it, but it was also one that was really predicated on interviewing experts, and that's something I'm super comfortable doing and have been doing professionally every day for 15 years, talking to people who know more about me than the subject and figuring out how to kind of contextualize, link arms with the reader who doesn't know anything either, and talk to people who do. So I don't recall that one being especially difficult, or this is back to 2019 now. So, but I don't recall that one being an especially big leap or especially big thing. That's some of what that approach is like that too, right? If the goal is to have professional at bats, sometimes you hit a single and sometimes you hit a home run, right? Sometimes you strike out too, but did you have a good eye? Did you take a couple pitches at least before you got to go back to the dugout? It's okay. And that's how that stuff's supposed to work, I think. There'll sometimes be stories that have a much longer gestation. I worked on a story that ran at the beginning of this year that was like kind of a sort of like a 48 hours in Portland thing for Bon Appetit. That was like it ended up being a big spread in the print, but it didn't get assigned like that. It was like it was going to be a little web thing of some restaurants and some bars, and then they had a bunch of stuff happen at the magazine and some new people come on or whatever, and came back to me and said, "Oh, your story's so great, and we have a 10-page hole in the March issue, so now it's going to be print and we're going to shoot it. We need you to do more work," and all this kind of stuff. But that was a story that from assigning to coming out was 10 months, 10 months, and that's long for freelance. Long enough that there were places that were in the earlier draft that by the time we were going to print weren't there anymore. A food cart that had moved and wasn't operating under the same name anymore, so you had to make a choice. So that's the longer kind of gestation. I think that's one of the other things that's like when you think about comparatively with something like some of those sort of crime writing or reported fiction or whatever, you're talking about these longer scales of work, years, longer scales of work, and that's very different from what the journalism stuff is. I don't know, but a story should take like a month.
So one of the things you've written about somewhat recently is the Portland wine scene specifically, and the expansion of it, the amount of places you can go in Portland to enjoy wine. So tell me about the growth of wine in Portland as you've been paying attention to it, and the consumer options there from a wine bar, bottle shop perspective.
So for Portland specifically, sometimes it feels like it's a little bit like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. In some ways, I would think Portland would be a little further along with wine stuff than it is right now. And I've talked about this with folks that work in and around wine who echoed some of those same sentiments. At the same time, there is some awesome wine stuff in Portland. And the thing that I think our city does particularly notably, really like nationally notably, is with the bottle shops, is with the retail in Portland. And there's this cool sort of perfect Venn diagram for the bottle shops in Portland of, this deeply rooted, now multi-generational local wine production culture, which has had the knock-on effect of creating what is now also a deeply rooted multi-generation wine import industry of people bringing wines into Oregon from around the world to be part of the wine culture, and no sales tax. So you wind up in this place where Portland is one of the greatest places in the country to buy wine from around the world. And while there might be some import stuff that you could only get in LA or New York 5 years ago, I feel like that gap's really closed. I don't feel like, I remember I used to go and travel around in America and be like, oh, well, I'm going to fill up my suitcase and buy all this wine because I can't get it back home. I don't really feel like it's like that anymore. I can buy all the little cult, weird Burgundy guys here, and everybody's fighting over bringing that stuff in and having it in Oregon, and so many cool bottle shops and new things that have opened, and then also places that have been around for 20, 30 years and have the relationships and have the expertise and are able to have all this great stuff. And it's really an amazing city if you like bottle shops and just like looking at all the labels and kind of learning visually like that and stuff. It's so cool. And I made a big point in that Bon Appetit story about Portland, of being like, it's funny because sometimes when you talk to generalist food and beverage editors, bottle shops get kind of put away. They're like, well, that's not exciting, that's not cool. And the folks I was working with BA, to their credit, were very cool. They were like, okay, well, if you say this is one of the special cultural things here, and I really do think so, but there's restaurants with some good wine lists, and there's some good wine bars for sure, and I like that places that can kind of do that and have their own POV, or I think a lot of times the wine shops are kind of hybridizing with some of the wine bars. There's a couple places like that in the city that I think are really good, where like it's almost in that like French like cave model, where like people are drinking there, but you can buy bottles, and or maybe the bar is through a little doorway, but then the bottle shop is over to here, and it's sort of all in the same footprint. I like stuff like that. I think stuff like that's really cool.
How else have you seen the Oregon wine industry develop, Portland scene specifically, Oregon wine in general? How have you seen the wine scene develop here, and what do you sort of see as the next phase for Oregon wine?
Something that I think is cool that happens here, and it's been going on for a long time, but I think that it's really tremendously important, is the pull that the wine industry in Oregon has for bringing in young people who want to come learn and work. And that young people come here to learn and work about wine from all over the world. And some of them stay, and some of them take ideas and take it back out wherever else. But along the way, they'll develop, a knowledge and an affection for Oregon wine. And I think that that's created a little bit of this like Johnny Appleseed thing for Oregon wine over the decades that's really important. And I'll have people say it back to me, in wine stuff. Oh, I live in Portland. Oh, I worked a vintage somewhere, whatever. You hear it from people, and it is this really impactful thing. And you sort of, I don't know, I had a conversation like that. I was at a wine bar in New York a week or two, or like 6 months ago, and there was people having that same, oh, you were in Portland, I did this thing in the Gorge, I was, whatever. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here too, things like places like the Gorge, where the fruit's maybe a little less expensive, and it feels like the story isn't quite as written the same way, and there's some daylight, there's some ability to kind of make your dream come true and go out and do your thing. People want to do that, there's some interesting stuff like that. I don't know, I went to a winery kind of tasting lunch thing, earlier this year, and the person leading the winery tasting lunch thing was from Italy. And they were like, in their 20s, and they were from Italy, and they were like, well, this is where I wanted to come, come learn and spend time. And I think that's really good, really, really good thing. Even if it doesn't necessarily mean they stay and do their wine dream here, I think having that kind of stuff flow through here, maybe it's for a month, maybe it's for the rest of their lives. Wine is so tremendously personality driven and individual driven. It's one of the things that makes it so fun and interesting. And the more interesting people in wine around the world who, at some point breathe a little Oregon air and spend a little time here, I think it's really, really good. Really, really to the benefit. And you see it, I think, also in the interest in the wines in other parts of the world, too. I remember going to Chamber Street Wine in New York, the really influential wine shop in New York, when I was first kind of learning about wine, and them having maybe one or two things from Oregon, and now you go, and it's more like 10, There's a couple of really good Oregon wine importers there in London now. There's, a big market for Oregon wine in some corners of wine culture stuff in, Japan. And there's an Oregon winemaker I'm friendly with whose wines are being served at some really nice restaurants in Singapore and Taipei. And, that footprint thing is growing. I think that we're also still comparatively small and scrappy compared to the California behemoth, and that's actually an okay place to be in a lot of ways too.
And for you personally, how has writing about wine changed, either in general or for you specifically?
Well, it's funny. I think I mentioned I did like Is Natural Wine Cool Anymore story, and when I did that story, I was like, oh, are people going to have me be like the am I going to be like the heel now? Am I going to have more people be like, write for us about how you don't think natural wine is cool too? And I didn't really hear that. Instead, what I had somebody be like, okay, we want you to do that story, but like about whiskey, or like, will you do that story except about craft beer? Like, I've had people kind of be like, write more about arcs of cool in drinks and less about the specific wine thing in drinks, which I actually really like. Like, I think that's really great. Wine writing is something that I love doing, but I was doing a lot of it for a little while, and I've maybe backed off just a scooch and doing other kinds of stuff. The thing for me is that wine is like what I look at my phone when I'm not working. Like, I'm a wine hobbyist increasingly. Like, I actually just really enjoy it, like, personally, which I don't necessarily feel like that about the same way for all the other stuff I write about. Even increasingly for things like going to restaurants, like as I'm going to restaurants more for work, I'm finding less personal enjoyment and pleasure in going to restaurants. But wine has not had that effect for me. I think wine is so massively vast, and the way I came into wine through these sort of hippies use the side door partition of the natural wine thing has made it so my discovery has been through the reverse, right? Like, I'm drinking like a lot of Bordeaux now, you know, like, because I just never had exposed to it, and to me it's so uncool it's cool, like that, and has the happy effect of also being like comparatively a great value. I mean, you can drink some outstanding, you know, really wines of the world from Bordeaux with a little age on it and stuff, and because, you know, a lot of young people don't care, a lot of people just in general don't care. It's fallen out of fashion in a lot of circles, not everywhere, I mean with everyone, but, you know, popularly in a lot of ways. You know, and that's been reflected in places like Bordeaux and sales statistics, and, you know, especially with things like, you know, the Sauternes and sweet wines and things like that have fallen out of style. And to me, it's like, oh, that's so interesting. Like, cool. You know, I think that's fun. Wine is so massively vast, and the logic of it, it's like a broken slinky, you know, it doesn't pull out and go back like normal. It's like stuff costs way too much for no reason, stuff is cheap for no reason. It rewards knowledge in a way that very few other hobbies do. There's this special joy of like being at a restaurant and being like, why is that so cheap? I know that wine. Why is that so cheap? This is so cool that they have it, and it's incredible that they priced it for that. There's this layer of geekiness to it that's like, to me, it's the same thing as being like, this is the only concert in 1975 that they opened the second set with Eyes of the World, and why did it transition into China Cat Sunflower, and why did they break out this one weird version of He's Gone that year and then never again for 5 years? There's this like rewarding the geekery thing that some kind of music does. I'm making like Grateful Dead jokes, but like that wine rewards this level of layers and layers and layers of geekery and like knowledge and time that is the payoff is like it makes me happy. I think it's cool. It's fun. I don't know if that means like writing about that necessarily, but just like for me as a human being, I find it really pleasurable.
You mentioned obviously a project you're wrapping up now, you're excited about coming out soon. What else is on the horizon for you, personally, professionally, in any way? What else are you excited about?
Yeah, you know, I'll be home for a good chunk. I'm going to go back out for a good chunk. I'll go to Chicago next week. I'm going to go to New York the week after that. I'm going to have some time in LA. Some of that travel I'll get to do with my family, which I'm really excited about, and that's going to be really fun. Spending more time down in LA is always really fun. That city's really great. Spending time in New York is fun. That city's really great. Portland is, and this sounds like I mean it as a diss, but I really don't. I've found this very happy balance in my life of like, I have a job where I'm gone, you know, a week, a month, sometimes more like 10 days a month. And Portland is a wonderful place to live for that, because I can leave for a week and kind of nothing happened. Like, it's fine. Like, if I lived in New York City and I was gone 10 days a month, I'd be like, why would I do that? You know, in New Yorkers, it turns into the view from 9th Avenue fairly quickly, even if you have one of those jobs. You're like, oh, I'm not gonna leave. This is the center of the universe, you know? I really like living somewhere that is not the center of the universe and would never be mistaken for it. Because it means I can go to all of these other places and then like come back home and like hide and write about stuff and like do the thing that I actually do, which is like writing and sending it out, and then go back other places and have those experiences. I don't know how anybody lives in New York and writes. Where do you find time? There's New York to do. So how do you find time? Versus like back home in Portland, like I can find time. Yeah, I don't know. When I'm in New York, I'll meet with a bunch of food media people and talk to them and figure out what I want to do. For some upcoming story stuff. I've been having a fun thing. We've done this now for the last couple of years, where my business partner and I, in the summertime, he takes a month off and I am like the primary, and then I take a month off and he is like the primary. So we'll do that again this summer, knock on wood. And I think I'm going to get to do mine in July, which I'm really excited about. And I will use that time to like just work on other kinds of writing stuff without any of the sort of daily deadline things or freelance deadline things or whatever. And I'm starting to get really excited about getting to spend time doing that really like off of the speed chess clock, like kind of away from the efficiency stuff and just getting to sort of try to develop out this other thing and learn how to be bad at something. Yeah.
All right. All the questions that we have for you today. Anything we didn't ask that we should have? Anything you want to talk about that we didn't talk about?
I don't think we talked about wine very much. I don't know.
Enough.
Yeah. Well, wine's great though. You know, what can you say? It's good. I really think it's that thing of like, that's been the happy thing about wine for me. And the thing that I couldn't have necessarily predicted or expected is that of all of the things that I have ever gotten to work on or write about or whatever, it's the thing that like personally brings me joy and is fun and interesting and endlessly rewarding to dive into, because it almost in a way makes me want to write about it less because I like it, you know, and it's hard to be impartial. But getting to write about wine has also been really fun and really good to me, and I feel like I'm always trying to kind of creep it into things or work its way into things. And Oregon's been such a really wonderful place to go. I've spent so much more time in the Valley this year too, which has been really cool, and I'm doing that a lot more. And this was a good excuse to come down here today because I'm going to go to some wineries after and go see some more stuff. It's fun. But yeah, well, no, I think that's everything. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your time, sharing your stories with us. Let you off the hook.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.